Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get started right on time. Welcome to each one of you gathered here this evening. I said to some folks over dinner this evening, I feel like I'm playing a bit of catch-up. I wasn't able to be here last evening. I was in Moncton, actually, for the installation of the Reverend Dr. Bruce Fawcett as the president of Crandall University. And most of you might recognize his name. Bruce was our former academic dean and also the director of our Doctor of Ministry program. And it was a pleasure to be with them at the university. So greetings from our sister institution, Crandall University. This evening, it's my pleasure to be able to give you just a little bit of introduction, not just to the guest speaker, our lecturer for this year, our Hayward Lecture, but to give you a bit of background. And if you have a brochure on the Hayward Lectures, we do provide a bit of background on that. But sometimes it's good for us to be reminded in terms of not only the gift of where we are, in this case, in this beautiful setting, but that lectureships are made possible by individuals who have a vision that exceeds their own generation. And that's certainly the case with regard to the late Mrs. C.C. Hayward of Wolfville, who had a vision for this kind of lectureship. And it was 47 years ago that this lectureship began. And you'll see some of the names that are in our brochure that talk about some of the outstanding guests and lecturers that we've had with us here at Acadia University. And although these lectureship series are hosted by the Divinity College, this is actually an Acadia University lectureship, and it is sponsored through the Faculty of Theology of the university. So that's always good to just remind people of as well in terms of context and setting. We've had guests like Elton Trueblood, John Bright, Helmut Kester, Richard Longnecker, James Dunn, N.T. Wright, Stanley Porter, Edith Humphrey, and last year Simon Gathercole of the UK. The Hayward Lectures focus on the theoretical and academic side of theological education, emphasizing biblical studies, theology, and church history. Several years ago, the Acadia Studies in Bible and Theology series was launched, and perhaps Dr. Evans will say something to us later this evening about that series. It's published by Baker Academic in order to provide a publication venue for the Hayward Lectures. And I believe to date we have 7 volumes and 2 in the press. So that's always good news. And you'll find these volumes along with volumes by tonight's distinguished lecturer displayed on the table in the foyer. I want to add my personal welcome to Stephen and Jan Evans. We had the opportunity to share a meal with them this evening. Delightful couple. Thank you for coming and being with us in Atlantic Canada, specifically to Acadia. This afternoon we had the privilege of having him with us as faculty. And although we were to share lunch together at noon and it did not arrive until 10 to 1, we kept him very busy with all kinds of questions and incredible points of conversation. I want to mention as well that tomorrow morning you'll have the opportunity to hear Dr. Evans again at worship at Manning Chapel, and that worship service will take place at 11:30, and so please mark that, and hopefully you'll be able to join us at Manning at 11:30. In the afternoon, we'll have a talk-back session with our guest lecturer, and that will be at 2 o'clock, and that will be at Acadia Divinity College. Dr. Evans, is there anything else that should be announced at this point, or have we pretty well covered that? All right. Last evening, Dr. Evans gave you an overview, I believe, and gave a formal introduction to our guest. And so I won't go into great detail this evening and take time away from the lecture. But for those of you, how many of you are here this evening for the first time? Well, there are quite a few of you who are here. I would just let you know that Dr. Evans is professor of philosophy and humanities in the Department of Philosophy at Baylor University in Waco, Texas. He's held this position since 2001. He's known for his work on the philosophy and theology of Søren Kierkegaard, the philosophy of religion, and the philosophy of the human sciences. He has served on a number of editorial boards He has served on the editorial boards of a number of journals and scholarly series. Prolific author and educator. We're very honored and privileged to welcome you, sir, and we welcome you now. So I would invite you to come forward and give us this evening's lecture. And as you do, I'd like to have a word of prayer for our session tonight. Let's bow in God's presence. Lord God, we acknowledge you to be the author of wisdom. We thank you that from you proceeds truth, knowledge. We thank you that you've given us the capacity to think and to reason, to speculate, to be drawn into wonderful conversations and deep discourse. And we pray for our lecture tonight and for all of us gathered here that in the midst of this evening's lecture, you'd guide our thinking and our speaking. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Welcome.
Sound on? Great. Well, it's certainly been great to be here. I'm so honored by this invitation, and the hospitality has just been overwhelming, and the beauty of Nova Scotia has been amazing. So we can't wait to get back. Last night, I argued that it was important to challenge the new atheist claim that there is no evidence for the reality of God. And I argued that if we have a realistic view of the goals of natural theological arguments, if we recognize, for example, that there is no presumption of atheism, but that the burden of proof lies equally on rival worldviews, and if we have the right kind of understanding of the sort of evidence that's needed and that might be possible if God is real, the prospects for natural theology are good. The evidence, I argued, should meet the constraints of two principles. I call them the Pascalian constraints because they're inspired by a quote from Pascal. The wide accessibility principle, the idea that any evidence for God that's important should be widely available to ordinary people. And the easy resistibility principle, the idea that the evidence for God should be such that those who don't want to have a relation to God could ignore it, reinterpret it, explain it away. Now, we also saw last night that Pascal uses the term signs for the kind of evidence that meets these two constraints, and I think he was wise to do so. On the one hand, signs can be very evident and easy to grasp. Even children can learn to read road signs. On the other hand, signs do have to be interpreted, and it is possible to misinterpret them, as travelers in a foreign country can sometimes find out to their chagrin. And signs can also be ignored. The possibility of misinterpretation opens up space for willful ignoring of a sign, as well as willful misreading of a sign, as well as the more innocent case of someone who just hasn't learned how to read a sign. So the concept of a sign seems a promising one to employ to understand how a natural knowledge of God might be possible. However, what might it mean to speak of a natural sign? I actually should have changed slides earlier. That's the outline of the whole talk there, but we'll take a quick look. We're now going to move to Thomas Reid's concept of a natural sign. Not a very good picture of Thomas Reid, I'm sorry to say. I couldn't find anything better than that. Natural signs would be signs whose meaning is not conventionally established, as is the case for human highway signs. They are signs that humans have some sort of innate disposition to read in a certain way. I borrow this term from the Scottish Enlightenment philosopher Thomas Reid, who uses it in his theory of perception. My concept of a natural sign for God, what we might call a theistic natural sign, is modeled on Reid's concept of a perceptual natural sign. Reid holds that perception of the world is made possible by sensations we receive from that world, and he calls those sensations natural signs. However, unlike some of the other modern philosophers, such as Locke, who attempted to show how we could infer the existence of that external world by reasoning from the inner sensations we directly have awareness of, Reid held that in the typical case, our perception of the external world doesn't involve any inference at all. It's psychologically direct. And so his philosophy is often called the philosophy of Scottish realism, sometimes common sense realism. When we see green grass, for example, we don't normally infer the existence of the grass. We don't, for example, offer an argument like this: I'm having the kind of sensations one would expect to have if there were green grass in front of me, so probably there is green grass in front of me. We don't perform any act of inference or reasoning at all. Rather, we simply have the sensations and we form the belief that we're looking at grass, assuming we're paying attention in the right way. Now, it might be possible to reason from sensations to the things we perceive by them, although Reid is doubtful that that is possible. But in order to reason from signs or sensations to other things, we would need to direct our attention to the sign itself, rather than, as is normally the case, what it is that we perceive by means of the sign. But even if it were possible to reason from the sign to what is perceived by the sign, it's not necessary in most cases. We don't need to perform any act of inference or reasoning at all. Now, Reid thinks that some of the natural signs that are involved in perception are what he calls original natural signs, in the sense that we don't have to be taught their meaning. An example is the sensation of hardness we have when we press against a solid object. When I teach Reid, I'll ask my students, you could try this. Just take your finger and press it on something hard and concentrate on the feeling that you have. There's a certain sensation there, and it just irresistibly conveys to us that's hard, and we get a sense of what hardness is from that sensation. But notice the sensation you have is not itself hard. It's a sensation. It's nothing like the quality that you are perceiving in the world. It's a sign that gets you to the world, but there's no resemblance or copying or anything like that. Another example, a very important example for Reid of original natural signs would include facial expressions. He says, and modern psychology says he's right about this, even infants naturally respond to smiles with smiles of their own, and they perceive angry facial expressions as threatening. We don't need to be taught those things. We're sort of hardwired to respond that way. Most natural signs, however, are not original, but they are what Reid calls learned natural signs. For example, we experience the smell of a lemon on several occasions, and we develop the ability to recognize a lemon just from that smell. So you smell something that's lemony, and you say, oh, lemon, and you don't perform any act of reasoning or inference. You just recognize that's a lemon there. Even though the meaning of the sign is learned in the latter case, the recognition of the lemon is then still psychologically direct. It requires no inference or reasoning. One might say that learned natural signs are in one sense just as natural as the original natural signs. And I'm going to argue that the natural signs for God are signs in the second sense. They are learned natural signs. And that's important because learned natural signs are more subject to cultural influence. They can be shaped by culture and our expectations in ways that the original natural signs can't. So what is necessary for a natural sign to be a natural sign? Well, Reid says in the case of perceptual natural signs, we need three things. First, we need a causal connection between the sign and what the sign signifies, so that the sign can be a reliable indicator of what it signifies. Second, in order for the sign to be a sign, it must have the purpose or function of being a sign. It must be intended to be a sign. For Reid, sensations are natural signs because they are designed by God to give us perceptual knowledge. God could have made us in such a way that perhaps we could have perceived the world without sensations, maybe in some other way. Or he could have given us entirely different sensations. Charmingly, Reid says, we could have seen the world through our noses or tasted the world through our ears. I'm not sure what that would have looked like, but but in fact, this is the way God has set it up. It's part of the design plan, so to speak. The third element, Reid says, is that there must be a natural tendency on the part of those who receive the signs to respond appropriately. We have to have a kind of natural tendency to read the sign in the right way. Now, it's not difficult to see that if there are signs for God, all of these Reidian conditions could easily be met. First, if God exists and is the creator of all things, there surely will be a causal connection between God and any signs that he creates. And second, it's quite conceivable that God has made certain features of the natural world with the intention that those features be signs that point to him. The psalmist says, the heavens are telling the glory of God. Third, God could easily give humans a natural tendency to respond to those signs by having a tendency to form a belief in God or gods. Now note that it makes no difference how God might install this natural disposition. The important thing is just that the disposition is there. In particular, if it's true that God has created humans through an evolutionary process, as I assume is the case, then there's no reason why God could not use that evolutionary process to instill in humans this natural disposition to form beliefs about him or in him. This last point is quite important because there is a significant amount of scientific evidence that there are natural tendencies in humans to form a belief in God or gods. Now, 50 years ago, most social scientists who were trying to explain why people were religious, why they had beliefs in God, would appeal to things like psychological needs, as in the case of Freud, or sociological functions, as you might see in Durkheim or in Marx. However, today, psychologists and cognitive scientists are increasingly drawn to the idea that religious beliefs are something that have been hardwired into human beings by the evolutionary process that has made us what we are. They think we just naturally respond to certain features of our natural environment by forming a belief in divine agents. Even children, to use the striking image of a contemporary psychologist, who happens to be an atheist, by the way, she says children are, quote, intuitive theists, prone to, quote, promiscuous teleology. They see purpose everywhere. Now, to be sure, the majority of scientists who are pursuing this research program are atheists, and they believe that these hardwired dispositions to form these beliefs in God are what they call spandrels. A spandrel is an unintentional byproduct of other features of our cognitive makeup that had some sort of evolutionary survival value. So they obviously don't think that evolution selected for the ability to believe in God, but that evolution selected for some other factor which, as a byproduct, gave us this tendency to believe in God. However, if there is a God, if God exists, and if God has created us through this evolutionary process, there is no need to interpret these dispositions as useless byproducts. They could actually be the means whereby God has given us an ability to recognize his reality. And there are some of these researchers who have recognized this possibility. Some of them are open to this idea. Now, one might at this point object in a variety of ways. One objection goes like this. One might say, look, Evans, these natural tendencies to believe in God, they're real, but they don't lead to belief in the true God. More often than not, they lead to what we used to call paganism. Not a very politically correct word today. And is now more apt to be called primal religions, or maybe tribal religions. After all, you might think, belief in God or gods may be pervasive among human cultures, but from a Christian point of view, the true knowledge of God is not pervasive. To this objection, I have two replies. First, Christian missiologists are increasingly inclined to see more value in primal religions than was previously the case. In many cases, the believers in these faiths, when presented with the Christian gospel, see their former faith as preparation for the good news they've come to believe. They already believed in supernatural beings. In many cases, they even believed that there was a high God or a supreme God. They just didn't know enough about this God. They didn't know what this God was really like. And they especially did not know that this God had revealed himself through his Son, Jesus of Nazareth. The second response is this. It's essentially to say, yes, that's true, but it doesn't matter. Perhaps the intended outcome of these natural signs is not a full, accurate, positive knowledge of God at all, but what I called last night anti-naturalism. To understand God in the way we must understand him, to have a relation to him, our knowledge of him must be based on special revelation, God's special self-revelation, not simply on general features of the natural order. But the natural signs perhaps are not intended to give us that kind of adequate knowledge of God. They're intended only, you might say, to inoculate us against a naturalistic worldview. They're intended to give us a sense that there is more to reality than the physical world. They point us beyond the world to a reality that may be mysterious. They themselves don't fully dispel that mystery. They are signs that prepare us to encounter God's self-revelation. So the fact that these natural signs may produce primal religions and so on is, in my view, not disturbing. C.S. Lewis, I'll just interrupt here with one anecdote. C.S. Lewis was once asked, "Aren't you afraid that England is becoming a pagan country?" And Lewis said, "Would that it were true, because paganism," he says, "is fertile soil for the gospel." Now, last night I mentioned the contemporary philosophers of religion who are known as Reformed epistemologists, such as Alvin Plantinga. We're now in a position to give an interpretation of these Reformed epistemologists' claim that belief in God can be properly basic and not based on arguments or inference. You'll recall I noted that they appeal to the claim of John Calvin that God has implanted in us humans a sensus divinitatis, a sort of natural faculty for believing in God, a natural tendency to believe in God. Perhaps this sensus divinitatis works through the natural signs that God has implanted in the world and in us. And if that's right, we can say, yes, the Reformed epistemologists are right. Belief in God can be properly basic because beliefs that are formed as a result of the natural signs don't necessarily involve any inference or argument. So they can be basic beliefs because they're not based on other beliefs or theories. But it doesn't mean that these beliefs don't have any ground or basis at all. The ground of the beliefs is the natural signs that give rise to the beliefs. Does that mean these natural signs should be considered evidence for God? I think the answer to this question is yes, in two different senses. First of all, though I do agree the signs can operate, as Reformed epistemologists say, to produce belief in a very direct way, it also seems possible for us to make the signs themselves the objects of our reflection and develop arguments from the signs to God's existence. And I'll say a little more about this in a minute. But in that case, the signs would actually function as propositional evidence, or as so they can be evidence in a non-propositional sense, but also in a propositional sense. However, even in the case where the signs operate to produce the belief in this more spontaneous matter, I want to say we can still call them evidence. So when the Reformed epistemologists say that belief in God need not be based on evidence, they are using the term evidence in a special way. They mean by evidence propositional evidence, premises that can serve as the basis for an argument or an inference. But I believe there is a well-established sense in which evidence can be non-propositional, consisting of experiences or even of physical objects, as when the police view the fingerprints left at the scene of the crime as evidence. It's the actual fingerprints that are the evidence, not just what we say about the fingerprints. In this non-propositional sense, even when we are not employing these signs as the basis for an argument, the natural signs for God's existence, I think, can still be properly called evidence, at least evidence for anti-naturalism. So what are the theistic natural signs and how can we recognize them? Tonight I think there are many, but tonight I'm going to discuss 5. What I call the experience of cosmic wonder, secondly, the experience of purposive order, our sense of being morally accountable or responsible, our sense that human beings have a special dignity and worth, and lastly, what I call, following C.S. Lewis, our longing for joy, transcendent joy. Now, in this brief talk, I can't possibly do justice to all of these. I have given a fuller account, and I'm going to take just 1 second to do a commercial here. If you want to take a look at my book, Natural Signs and Belief and Knowledge of God, there's a much more expanded treatment of all of this and much more rigorous treatment. The book has been available only in hardback for an astoundingly high price from Oxford, I'm sorry to say, but I'm told that it's already in paperback in the UK and will be released in the US and Canada within a week or 2. So anyway, it has a nice cover. So the first sign, sorry, missed my place. Shouldn't have given the commercial. If we want to find these signs, I think one important place to look is to examine the classical theistic arguments given by natural theologians, the classic arguments for God's existence. Because I believe that natural signs for God can be seen as the source of the intuitions that give these arguments whatever force they have. Now, these arguments are themselves puzzling because they've been refuted time and time again, and yet they continue to have appeal. Sometimes they even seem very appealing to the people who say they've refuted them. If natural signs lie at the core of these arguments, I think we can understand why this should be so. For the easy resistibility principle implies that the signs will always fail as coercive proofs. The person who is determined to avoid the conclusion can always find a way to do so. Nevertheless, the signs lying at the core of the argument continue to exercise their appeal, and they have force, sometimes I think very strong force. If we find that even non-believers in many cases recognize the force of these signs, that will be an important piece of evidence that they do have this power. So, cosmic wonder. There are times when it strikes almost everyone as strange and wonderful that the universe should exist at all. Why is there something and not nothing? I believe this experience lies at the core of traditional arguments that are called the cosmological arguments, which take as their starting point our sheer wonder and amazement that there should be a universe at all. If theism is true, then the world is contingent. It's the result of God's free creative activity. Our sense of wonder when we experience the world is a true perception of a real quality that the world possesses. The quality that theologians have sometimes called contingency. When I'm teaching, I like to use this phrase with my students. It's might never have beenness. That's what we're perceiving, because it's literally true that this universe is one that might never have been. It exists because of God's free creative activity. Now, of course, the atheist is free to dismiss this experience, to claim that the world as such is just a brute fact. They may admit that we have this sense of wonder, but deny that it points to anything. However, even atheists, for example, Camus, are struck by the absurdity of that idea. It appears to Camus, for example, that the world ought to have a meaning, a reason for being, but his atheism leaves him only with the absurd. So here's a quote from Camus. He says, "The world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. What is absurd is the confrontation of this irrational world and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart." For Camus, we humans are so constituted that we feel like the universe ought to have a certain character. That it does not have such a character seems absurd for him. Perhaps this wild longing for clarity that Camus speaks of is itself a natural sign, a clue that this universe is not intelligible by itself. It points beyond itself to its maker. Now, lest anyone think that such an experience is only felt by strange thinkers like Camus who are existentialists, I want to also cite the testimony of a contemporary analytic philosopher, J.J.C. Smart, who is a well-known atheist. Smart considers and rejects the cosmological argument for God's existence on the grounds that the argument requires the existence of a necessary being, a concept Smart says he can make no sense of. However, though rejecting the argument, Smart acknowledges the force of the experience that drives the argument. He says he feels the force of the question, why is there anything at all? Even though he says, I know I'll never be able to answer it. His final position leaves him uneasy. He says he wonders whether or not this experience is one that he ought to cherish or whether he should try to explain it away and not even have it. His naturalism ought to lead him to the second option, but he thinks the experience is in some way a deep one. He can't quite bring himself to just dismiss it as trivial and unimportant. He doesn't want to do that. Perhaps he is feeling the force of the natural sign. The second natural sign I want to discuss is what I call the experience of purposive order, which lies at the core of the classical argument for God's existence that we call the argument from design. By this experience, I mean the sense of wonder and mystery we gain when we look at the exquisite way a flower is organized, or the incredible intricacy of the human body and the way its different systems work together, or even a single cell, its amazing complexity. A similar experience is commonly had when someone contemplates a vast mountain range or a beautiful valley with all the ecological diversity and incredible symbiosis, the way it all works together. And these are experiences that virtually every human being has had at some time or other. Now, interestingly, even David Hume and Immanuel Kant, who are in the history of philosophy texts, are said to be the people who refuted the classical argument from design. These are the people who gave it its death knell, supposedly. They testify to the power of our experience of nature as purposive. Hume, for example, has a fictional hero, clearly a kind of alter ego, Philo, in Hume's dialogues concerning natural religion. And Philo admits the power of the natural sign. These are his words. He says, in many views of the universe and its parts, particularly the latter, the beauty and fitness of final causes strikes us with such irresistible force that objections appear to be what I believe they really are, mere cavils and sophisms. Nor can we then imagine how it was ever possible for us to repose any weight on them. Kant offers similar testimony. In his great Critique of Pure Reason, in which he claims to have refuted the design argument as a conclusive proof, Kant nonetheless praises the argument in similar terms. Here's Kant. Reason constantly upheld by this ever-increasing evidence, which though empirical is so powerful, it cannot be so depressed through doubts suggested by subtle and abstruse speculation, that it is not at once aroused from the indecision of all melancholy reflection, as if from a dream, by one glance at the wonders of nature and the majesty of the universe. This is important testimony, since it comes from people that you might call unfriendly witnesses, the people who claim to be against the arguments. Genuine natural signs ought to have recognizable force, and the force ought to be recognizable even to people who ultimately don't accept the conclusion that the sign points to. Now, of course, and you may be thinking this, our contemporary new atheists would likely respond to all this by saying that Hume and Kant just did not enjoy the benefits of our post-Darwinian perspective, and so they were too easily deceived by the appearance of purposive order in our universe. But it's not clear to me at all that the theory of evolution disposes of our experience of the universe as purposive. Evolution, after all, is only an account of how the order we experience in the natural world came into being. But it's not clear how an account of how that order came into being requires one to think of that order as illusory. Why shouldn't we see natural selection simply as the process God has used to actualize the order and meaningfulness that's actually present in nature and which is right there on the surface that we experience? Is the apparent purposeful order we see in nature an illusion? Nothing in the scientific theory of evolution, so far as I can see, requires one to think that it is. After all, the evolutionary process itself is one that depends on the laws of nature. And thus, far from showing that the order in nature is illusory, evolution actually shows that the order we experience on the surface of things, so to speak, depends on a still deeper, hidden order. The new atheists, rather than taking the laws of nature for granted as a brute fact, ought to reflect more than they do on the fact that the natural world is indeed fine-tuned to produce a world with beauty and value. If our experience of the world as purposive is a natural sign for God, it doesn't depend on any argument or inference to function as it does, any more than our sensations of green grass require an argument to generate a reasonable belief in green grass. All that is required for the experience to function as a natural sign is that the order and purposiveness we perceive be really present, and that it be something that God has created so as to make it possible for us to become aware of His reality. And all of that can surely be the case, even if God has chosen to actualize that order through an evolutionary process. Some of you may know that Alvin Plantinga has recently published a book on science and religion, Where the Conflict Really Lies. He says there's no conflict between religion and science, but there is a kind of conflict between the religion of naturalism and science, because he says naturalism has no explanation for the fact that our cognitive faculties, our senses, our mind, work so well to give us knowledge, including scientific knowledge of the world. Why do those faculties work so well unless they have some sort of function or purpose to accomplish what they accomplish? I'll just add one more thing here. Recently, this book by Al Plantinga was reviewed in, of all places, the New York Review of Books by a famous atheist philosopher at Rutgers, Tom Nagel. Very respectful, interesting review. Nagel says, I don't believe Plantinga for a minute. If I found myself believing in God as he does, I would think I was going crazy. So he's not a friend of religion by any means. But Nagel says, Plantinga's argument here is a powerful one, and we atheists ought to take it seriously. And frankly, I don't know what to say in response to this argument that our natural faculties, we have no good reason to believe they work well. It's an astounding review. I recommended a New York Review of Books about 2 issues ago. The new atheists, people like Dawkins, often seem to think that evolution and God are rival, mutually exclusive hypotheses about the origins of the natural world. Perhaps they think this because evolutionary theory posits that the process by which plants and animals have evolved is one in which the genetic mutations that the evolutionary process selects for or eliminates due to survival advantages or lack thereof are supposed to be random. You're right? Evolution depends on random mutations. Surely, they think, a process that depends on random mutations cannot be guided, and so God cannot have used an evolutionary means to achieve his ends. I'm sure this is what some of them think. However, this argument fails. It depends on a simple confusion and equivocation in what is meant by random. When scientists claim that genetic mutations are random, they don't mean that they are uncaused, or even that they are unpredictable from the point of view of biochemistry, only that the mutations do not happen in response to the adaptational needs of the organism. It seems entirely possible then for a natural process to include randomness in that sense, even though that whole natural order is itself one that's created and sustained by God. The sense of randomness required for evolutionary scientific theory does not imply then that the evolutionary process must be unguided, that it must be outside of God's control. The next 2 natural signs I want to point to both connect to our moral experience. One of these signs is simply our sense of moral obligation. It often seems to us, at least to those of us who are not sociopaths, that we have moral obligations not to do certain things, and maybe obligations to do other things. And we feel responsible, accountable for our actions. Yet responsible to whom? Accountable to whom? I believe that this sense of obligation that we have is a natural sign that points to the one who has created us and who has the authority to demand from us what is right and what is good. Even atheists such as the late Australian philosopher J.L. Mackie acknowledge the force of these intuitions, which is why Mackie, in his own moral philosophy, developed what he called an error theory. He basically held that the whole idea of morality is a kind of mistake. It's an error. It's a false theory. Mackie says our ordinary moral beliefs then are systematically mistaken. As a naturalist, he could find no way to make sense of them. Now, I know very well that contemporary secular moral philosophers have developed with great ingenuity a variety of theories that attempt to save the appearances of moral philosophy. But in my judgment, these attempts are unsuccessful, and that's actually the project of my next forthcoming book, a book on God and moral obligation, which, God willing, will be out early next year from Oxford. The unique character of moral obligation is generally recognized, but it's hard to explain. The legal philosopher Ronald Dworkin, I believe he's at Harvard now, I think he used to be in the UK. Dworkin provides a very clear example of what I mean by this in a recent book. Dworkin distinguishes between happiness, between being happy, and what he calls living well. And he says, it's possible to be happy and know that you're not living well, and it's possible to live well and still not be all that happy. Living well, he says, involves a moral dimension, and he says we know we are responsible to live well. Quote, we have a responsibility to live well, and we believe that living well means creating a life that is not simply pleasurable, but it must be good in that critical way. The fact that we are responsible for living life a certain way looks like an obligation, but Dworkin is baffled when he tries to explain this fact. It would be natural to think that the fact we are responsible implies we are responsible to someone, but Dworkin cannot fathom who that might be. You might ask, responsibility to whom? The only thing that occurs to him is Kant's answer, we're responsible to ourselves. And he says, it's misleading to answer responsibility to ourselves. People to whom responsibilities are owed can normally release those who are responsible, but we cannot release ourselves from our responsibility to live well. We must instead acknowledge an idea that I believe we almost all accept in the way we live, but it is rarely explicitly formulated or acknowledged. We are charged to live well by the bare fact of our existence as self-conscious creatures. That's Dworkin. Now, it seems to me that Dworkin's reply seems only to deepen the mystery of moral obligation. It's completely opaque to me why the bare fact that I exist as a self-conscious creature would lead to my being obligated to live my life in a certain way. What I think Dworkin in fact is offering is elegant testimony to a perceived conviction that we are subject to an obligation to live a moral life, but he doesn't have any explanation of why we have such an obligation. Suppose, however, that this sense that we are under moral obligation is a natural sign of God, an actual awareness of God's requirements for our lives. If that were the case, then we can understand why so many people have, through the millennia, thought that the moral life and the religious life were indeed closely connected, so that the former depends on the latter. Dworkin clearly feels the force of this sign, which certainly seems to point to an authority to whom we are responsible, even if he refuses to follow the sign to where it points. If we make this sense of obligation a datum and try to explain it, we will have a moral argument for theism, and I think such arguments are powerful. In my view, the sign is what underlies the argument and gives it that force, and the sign has power then even for people like Dworkin who don't treat it as a datum to be explained. And I think a lot of ordinary people just directly and spontaneously think of themselves as responsible and accountable to God as the authority who governs their lives. I think, by the way, I'm going to talk about Kierkegaard tomorrow night, by the way. If those of you who came to hear me talk about Kierkegaard, hold on one more night. But I'll throw in one Kierkegaard quote here. Kierkegaard says in one place, "There has never been an atheist in all of human history. Only people who wouldn't allow what they knew, that God existed, gain power over their lives." Very interesting. And I think the reason why Kierkegaard thought that is that Kierkegaard thought that God is the ground of moral obligation. So he thinks everyone's aware of God. Some people don't know it's God. They don't recognize that it's God's calling on their lives, but nevertheless, they do feel the force of it. Another important theistic sign that's connected to our moral lives can be found in our sense that human beings as such have intrinsic worth and dignity, a view that underlies the claim, I think, that there are natural human rights. The intuition that humans possess this kind of special moral status is today very widespread. It's even embodied in the UN's Declaration of Human Rights. However, I think it's very difficult for secular philosophers to explain why humans have the special value that they're supposed to have. Now, Kant famously attempted to ground human worth in reason. He says it's the fact that we're rational that gives us this special worth. But many of us believe that even infants and older people suffering from dementia and who don't have much in the way of reason nevertheless have a special worth and dignity that give us obligations to treat them justly and with dignity. Now, in the Christian view, humans are made in the image of God, who's both supremely good and the source of all other goods. If that's true, it's not surprising if humans are made in God's image that we have a deep worth and dignity, and that we can recognize that dignity because we have a value that mirrors the absolute value of God himself. Humans are in this case literally signs of God, and the value and worth they have as God's image bearers points back to God himself. Once again, I think this natural sign can function in two different ways. On the one hand, we might simply perceive humans as possessing a deep, profound value that points to their maker. We just instinctively recognize that humans are not just meaningless clumps of matter. When a person dies, we feel that even his corpse should be treated with respect. If we reflect on this worth and try to explain it, we can again see this sign as generating a moral argument that has genuine force. For the Christian view that humans are made in God's image makes sense of the fact that all humans, regardless of whether they're capable of much in the way of reasoning, have a special worth. Kierkegaard actually gives us a vivid image. I forgot I had Kierkegaard in this talk. Kierkegaard gives us a vivid image of the worth that humans have simply as humans in his great book, Works of Love. Kierkegaard expresses the idea that humans have a special worth in two ways. On the one hand, he speaks of a, quote, inner glory that all humans possess, and he also uses the image of a common watermark. First, he compares human life to a play. In a play, all the actors wear various costumes that befit their roles. One may play a beggar while another plays a king, and this is Kierkegaard, quote, "But when the curtain falls on the stage, then the one who played the king and the one who played the beggar, they're all one and the same actors." Human life also contains a great variety, and some are indeed beggars and some are kings. However, when at death the curtain falls on the stage of actuality, then they too are all one. They are human beings. Each person, whatever their earthly differences, possesses this inner glory. Every human being, according to Kierkegaard, could be compared to a fine piece of stationery. Take many sheets of paper, write something different on each one, then no one will be like another. But then again, take each single sheet. Do not let yourself be confused by the diverse inscriptions. Hold the paper up to the light, and you will see a common watermark on all of them. In the same way, the neighbor is the common watermark, but you see it only by means of eternity's light when it shines through the dissimilarity. Kierkegaard there is obviously referring to the great command to love your neighbor as yourself. Perhaps Kierkegaard can be taken as suggesting then that when we see our fellow human beings as our neighbor, in this special sense of neighbor, we are sensing this inner glory. The religious believer can make sense of this perception of human beings as having this kind of worth because we see humans as made in God's image. Maybe it's possible for someone who is not a believer or not yet a believer, nevertheless, to recognize this basic human worth as well. Such a person has seen the light of eternity that illuminates the common watermark. In that case, the person is seeing the image of God in the person, in recognizing the person as made in God's image, even if the person doesn't realize that that's what the person is seeing. This person would then be recognizing a natural sign for God, perceiving something that God created and intended to function as a pointer towards God, something that does indeed point towards God as the transcendent ground of the mysterious value we see in creation. I'm going to describe just one more natural sign for God tonight, what C.S. Lewis called joy. Now, it's well known that Lewis, who had lost his childhood faith and became an atheist as a schoolboy, eventually came back to faith in God when he recognized that a particular experience he'd been having all his life and had savored was in fact a longing for God. Even as a boy, Lewis had had, when reading certain poems or hearing music of a certain type, experiences that are quite hard to describe. Lewis first remembers the experience from a line of poetry: "Balder the Beautiful is dead, is dead." This just sent shivers down him when he saw it. Maybe it doesn't do anything for you, but it did a lot for Lewis. Later he has the same experience when he's reading Scandinavian mythology or hearing of music of a certain kind. It all becomes linked to what Lewis called northernness. The experience was a kind of longing for something that was always just out of reach, a transcendent reality that could not really be possessed. As a longing, the experience was really akin to something painful. He says, the stab, the pang, the inconsolable longing. And yet Lewis found such happiness in the mere intimation of this mysterious something he called joy that he wanted the experience more than anything in the world. Augustine famously said of God, "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until we find rest in you." Lewis understood his experience of joy to be a sign that he and other humans are pilgrims. We're on a journey to another country that in this life we can only dimly grasp. He finally came to see joy as an intimation of the God whom we are made to be united with and enjoy forever. Now, Lewis is hardly alone in this experience. Of course, many atheists appeal to this fact to criticize belief in God. They say, look, belief in God is just wish fulfillment. You want there to be a God, so you believe there is one. The fact that we want to believe in God, they say, doesn't show that God is real, but only that we have a great need to believe in God. Lewis, however, was unfazed by this kind of attack. It's true, he admits, that the fact that a human being desires something doesn't show that the person will get what he or she desires. A man on a life raft who is dying of thirst desperately longs for fresh water, but he may not be able to find it unless he's rescued. However, it would be odd indeed if there were some natural desire, something basic to human nature that could never be satisfied. The man on the life raft may not find water to drink, but it would be bizarre if he had a need and longing for water and there were no such thing as water. Similarly, Lewis argues, a person may or may not find God, but it would be very strange if people had a need for something that did not exist. It's instructive to compare Lewis's situation to that of a famous Spanish writer, one that my wife writes about quite a bit and knows a lot about, Miguel de Unamuno. Unamuno, like Lewis, had absorbed a kind of atheism as a student. He was influenced by a kind of scientific positivism that claimed that there was no rational basis for belief in God. He says, what enlightened person nurtured by science has faith? So Unamuno thinks if you're scientific, you really can't believe in God. However, for Unamuno, the intellect did not have the last word. Though he never fully recovered the firm faith of his childhood, he struggled all of his life to believe. And the ground of his struggle was his own need for God. Quote, "And if I believe in God, or at least believe that I believe in him, it is because more than anything else I want God to exist, and because his existence is revealed to me in my heart. Clearly, Unamuno recognized his own need for God as a kind of evidence for God's reality. Whether he fully believed or not, he felt the force of the sign. There are other natural signs for God that we could discuss, not commonly associated with arguments, such as our sense of gratitude for the goods of our lives and our sense of the beauty of the natural world. One of my favorite jokes is, do you know what the worst moment in an atheist's life is? When he feels really grateful and has no one to thank. But I hope I've said enough to show that, contrary to the new atheists, there is evidence for God's existence. Evidence which is both powerful and of precisely the kind we should expect to find. Even if this evidence doesn't give us knowledge of the Christian God, it does suggest the reasonableness of anti-naturalism, the reasonableness of being open to a revelation from whatever reality there may be that these signs point to. In my lecture tomorrow night, I'm going to turn to the question of what such a revelation from God would look like and how it could be recognized. Tonight, in conclusion, I want to very briefly, all too briefly, address two questions. And this is going to be hard to do briefly, but I'll do my best. One, should we think of these natural signs as evidence? Evidence for God, where God is just the name for a mystery that transcends the natural order? And two, assuming the natural signs are evidence, do they give us good evidence? Is it evidence that we should in some sense trust? And I think I've already really answered the first question by showing that these natural signs can function in two different ways. They can become objects of critical reflection. They can generate arguments that take the signs as their basis. In those cases, the signs clearly furnish evidence in the sense of propositional evidence. They give us premises from which God's existence can be inferred. However, as I've said, the signs can also function in a more spontaneous and direct way, as in Reid's natural signs. People can come to believe in God or gods on their basis without any kind of argument or inference. And I think, as I've said, that this is what the Reformed epistemologists, such as Alvin Plantinga, have in mind when they claim that belief in God can be properly basic. On my interpretation, the natural signs are the means, then, whereby Calvin's sensus divinitatis functions. So I would say, even in the case where we have the sensus divinitatis at work, there is a kind of evidence for God's reality, only in that case the evidence is non-propositional in character. And it still can provide rational support for a belief that is psychologically basic, that is not the product of any inference or argument. But perhaps the more important question is the second one that I just raised. Is the evidence provided by these natural signs good evidence? Is it sufficient to ground reasonable belief? Now, the answer one gives here will certainly be partly shaped by one's broader epistemology. The dominant epistemology of modern philosophy, by I mean philosophy from Locke and Descartes up to the beginning of the 20th century, the dominant epistemology of modern philosophy is what today is called classical foundationalism. Classical foundationalism seeks to provide an account of knowledge that shows how our most important beliefs can be derived from a foundation that is certain, very certain, highly certain, maybe absolutely certain. The goal is to justify our knowledge claims by showing them to be grounded in truths that any reasonable person can know, and know with certainty. This body of foundational truths is supposed to be knowable from an objective, disinterested standpoint, and it's supposed to provide us a method for adjudicating all disputes about what counts as knowledge and what counts as justified belief. Let me say unequivocally that measured by this standard, the natural signs for God do not provide either knowledge or justified belief. If the measuring stick is classical foundationalism, these natural signs fail. But I would say the problem does not lie in the signs, it lies in the epistemology of classical foundationalism. Judged by the same standards, we do not, according to, I think, classical foundationalism, know that there is an external world or know that other human beings have minds. So I think if you want to avoid a total and radical skepticism, you're going to have to reject classical foundationalism and come to some more modest and humble epistemology. And then prospects for the natural science may look better. Epistemology today is divided between lots of different camps. One argument is between the people who are called Methodists and the people who are called particularists. The Methodists do not refer, of course, to any religious denomination. The Methodists are people who believe that before we can know anything, we first must know what the method of knowing is. We must give an account of knowledge and how knowledge is obtained. We can then measure particular knowledge claims by the criterion of knowledge and see which ones pass the test, which ones are graded A1 certified knowledge. The Methodists would like something that guarantees that our knowledge is genuine knowledge. Particularists, by contrast, claim that we first begin by knowing some things, then it may be possible to reflect on what we know and develop an account of how we know it. Just as in philosophy of art, we begin by assuming that we know some art objects, and then we proceed to reflect on their nature and what makes them to be art. We don't start with a theory of art and then decide what's art. We start with our experience of art and then develop a theory of art on that basis. Obviously, particularists then don't think it's possible for us to give a guarantee in advance that our knowledge is genuine because we start with knowledge claims. Now, I think the particularists are right. Their view entails that we have no absolute guarantees for our knowledge. It's a kind of modest, humble epistemology. But it seems to me that this accurately reflects the human condition. And I think if we didn't already know some things before we started doing epistemology, we would never be able to do epistemology. Thankfully, my students know some things before they take Philosophy 3000, our epistemology course. What this means is no theory of evidence, no epistemology can tell you exactly when good evidence is good. What makes evidence good evidence is that it tracks truth. When we follow the evidence, we come closer to truth, or at least more likely to do so. Ultimately, then, our judgments about what counts as good evidence are linked to our judgments about what is true. The other great divide in contemporary epistemology today is the argument between the people who are called externalists and the people who are called internalists. Externalists roughly say that what converts a true belief into knowledge is some fact about the relationship between the knower and the external world, hence the externalist label. True beliefs, for example, are products of reliable truth-tracking processes, or perhaps the output of a properly functioning cognitive faculty aimed at truth. That's how we get the warrant, the justification for the beliefs that convert our beliefs into knowledge. Internalists, on the other hand, believe that what justifies a belief, what makes it knowledge, is not some fact about the relationship between the knower and the external world. It's some fact that is internal to the knower's consciousness. Hence, there's something you're aware of that makes your knowledge knowledge. It's something about your own consciousness. I must then, to know on an internalist view, have evidence that is accessible to my consciousness. So this is a great debate, a great argument. I'm not going to try and settle that argument tonight. What I'm going to do is to try and argue that regardless of which account is right, regardless of whether you are an externalist or an internalist, there's a plausible account which says that these natural signs work, that they provide us with strong and good evidence. First of all, let's suppose that the externalist is right. Well, if there is a God who has created the signs and given us a natural disposition to respond to those signs with belief in God, the externalist condition for warranted belief will be satisfied. We will be hooked up to the external world in a way that reliably produces true beliefs. But notice that the signs are also things we have conscious access to. To many people, even including some non-believers, they point to the reality of God. But that is what evidence looks like from an internalist point of view. I would argue that if the internalist is to avoid a complete skepticism again, he or she must accept a principle which philosophers usually call the principle of credulity, that goes something like this. All other things being equal, it's reasonable to believe that reality is as it appears to be to us. The natural signs are ways in which it appears or seems to be the case that there is something beyond the natural world, something like a god or gods. And so, for some people at least, I think these natural signs do provide evidence for God's reality of an internalist sort. How powerful the evidence will be, of course, will depend on how powerful the experiences are, how powerful the signs appear to be. And this may depend partly, of course, on us. It may very well be that if these signs are not as powerful to some people as they used to be, that may show that we as persons have lost some of our cognitive capacities. Kierkegaard is fond of saying, the problem with the modern world is something like this. We don't believe in God not because we're smarter or know more science. We don't believe because we have puny imaginations and we have lost our emotional capacities. So I will just close with personal testimony. For me, these signs are very powerful indeed, particularly my sense of moral obligation, my experience of human persons as having intrinsic worth and dignity, and my own desire and longing for eternal life. All these are things that point me to my Creator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very helpful, stimulating. We have time for some questions and interaction. Who would like to have first? Headley.
You have to hang on to it. I'm very concerned, Dr. Evan, as a retired pastor now in the Baptist world, that we're giving ammunition to people like Richard Dawkins in our attacks on evolution, in which churches promote creationism and attack evolution. I think in doing so, we are opening ourselves to attacks from people like these atheists. I think we do the same thing when we institutionalize homophobia in the constitutions of convention or churches or whatever. I think we're also giving ammunition to these atheists of today. And I wonder if you could comment on that. Is that so, or am I reading it wrong?
Well, I guess I have to agree with you. Particularly, I think it's, of course, scientific theories are fallible and they do change, but well-attested, almost universally accepted scientific theories, it seems to me that we should think hard before, as Christians, we want to put ourselves on the wrong side of such theories. And so tonight, as you can tell, I was at pains to accept evolutionary ideas and to show how they're compatible even with natural theological arguments. That's not to say that philosophically, I think some of the criticisms of evolutionary theory made by intelligent design are worthy of reflection and consideration. We should always be open to debate and argument about these things and not dogmatic. But I certainly think the church makes a mistake when it allies itself with bad science. I also think that it's very important, the church must fully live out the principle of neighbor love. Neighbor love means that all human beings are my neighbors, as I read the Gospels. All human beings have intrinsic worth and dignity, and they must be loved in that way. So regardless of the beliefs one may have about the rightness or wrongness of marriage relationships and so on, there's no excuse for treating any individual in a way that's unloving or hateful or anything approaching that. So I agree that that's that when that happens, it's devastating for our witness and our testimony. And we have to love our neighbor, no exceptions.
Thank you. Someone else?
I have a question. Dr. Evans, regarding especially your second moral sign, it's on the back there, number 4, how important is that sign and the rest of them, universal experience of them? It's especially this one, it seems to me that if we look back through human history, special dignity and worth of human beings was not always the case. And I think also of one of the arguments against the new atheists, who someone like Sam Harris, who argue about having morality, and one of the arguments against it is that, like it or not, they've lived and breathed in a society that's been shaped by Christian values, and like it or not, they've inherited that, and that's why they have morality. So it doesn't seem to me that special dignity or worth is necessarily a universal experience.
Well, sure, and that's a good question, and certainly that introduces a qualification in that not every one of these natural signs, when I say they are widely available or accessible, that doesn't mean they're universally available or accessible. It means, I think, that we have a kind of capacity to recognize them. Now, certainly that capacity is not actualized, and it can be suppressed and overridden when we have, you might say, a culture where the level of moral insight is not very great. When basically it amounts to my family, my tribe, we treat well, everybody else will treat how we wish, us against them. And humans regrettably have had this tendency to say us and them, and to treat them as, subhuman. But notice that at least us, we're the Greeks. The Greeks said, we're the Greeks. The others, they're the barbarians. The term barbarian comes from the Greek sort of way of referring disparagingly to non-Greeks. But at least the Greeks recognize the value of themselves as Greeks. And I think, when we reach a certain level of education and start to think and realize, we are all humans. The differences are not that great. And the value that we think we have, if we're rational and consistent, we'll admit that other people have that value too. That there is pressure put on us to reject this sort of view, I would agree. And I do agree with you that there is a kind of, we're drawing down what we might call the cultural capital of the West and our Jewish Christian heritage. You can see that clearly in Nietzsche, who says more or less plainly, Nietzsche has a lot of contempt for the secular moralists, both English and Marxist, because he thinks they're still presupposing Christian morality. And Nietzsche wants to make a clean break with the whole business. He says if you reject the Christian God, you should reject it all. You can see this very clearly too if you go to China and you talk not just to the Christians there, but talk to the non-Christian intellectuals. They look at the West and they say, I don't want to be a Christian like you all, but I sure wish we had your Christian ethics. We need it. We'd like to do that. And we have these people coming to Baylor and coming out to other American universities, and I'm sure Canadian universities, to study and figure it out. Sometimes they're even more crass. They say, "Oh, we want to figure out how Christianity has made you so prosperous." I hope that's not the real secret. But sometimes merely being honest and not being corrupt can lead to prosperity. And so there may indeed be some connections there, and that. So you make a good point there. There is something here that I think can be seen, the potential to see it. Maybe it's seen in other cultures, Confucius at times, the Buddha. I'm not saying it's only something present in Christianity. I think it's still a natural sign, meaning it's cross-cultural. But I agree that in many cultures that sign is overridden, suppressed, it doesn't function very well.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for your talk tonight. I really appreciate that. I really appreciate your criterion of accessibility, how this should be accessible, whatever the level of intelligence of the person. I fear that with that comes a notion that, okay, we can just wipe our hands of this after listening to it for an hour and we've got it all down pat, and yet here you are, a professor of philosophy, you teach courses on epistemology, there must be more to it. And just thinking about our institution, Acadia Divinity College, and there's always a pressure to fit courses in, and I'm just wondering, what is the place for a rigorous study of epistemology in theological education? I'm pretty sure that you can get through Acadia Divinity College without ever hearing the word.
Well, I think it's important. Obviously, we can't all be professional epistemologists. I mean, I'm not a professional epistemologist. I'm a philosopher. I have colleagues, Professor John Kvanvig, for example, and Trent Dougherty, who are really high-level professional epistemologists. And they have an expertise in these areas that I can't promise to have. But as in all things, we are a community, and there is division of labor. And so I can learn from John Kvanvig and Trent Dougherty, and I don't have to do all the things they do. And perhaps some of the rest of us can learn from them, and maybe even learn from me. When I wrote my a book that the other Dr. Evans mentioned last night, I wrote a book back in the early 90s called The Historical Christ and the Jesus of Faith. And the central chapter of that book is a chapter that I have jokingly called more than once Epistemology for Theologians and Biblical Scholars. It's where I tried to sort of lay out, I mean, I was acutely conscious as I went through this issue, these stuff tonight at the end, that I was trying to perhaps do more in the last 5 minutes than can reasonably be done. So certainly there's a lot more to be said about this. I do say a lot more in my book, Natural Science and Knowledge of God. And I think it's very important as part of theological education to think a bit about what is knowledge. Why does John Calvin, for example, say, we shouldn't think of knowledge and faith as mutually exclusive categories. Rather, we should speak of the knowledge that comes by faith, which I think is right, by the way. So that's important, but it doesn't mean we all have to become epistemologists, thankfully.
Thank you. We have time. I see two more hands. We'll go to them, and then I think we'll call it an evening. Jeremiah?
Thank you, Professor Evans, for your wonderful talk tonight. I have three very brief questions for you. One, is it true that atheism, new atheism, is more prevalent in Western countries? Question two, I wanted to ask you this last night, just in your talk responding to new atheism. I find it interesting that in different humanitarian situations I've been in, I don't see a new atheist tent handing out bottled water. And so I want to ask you about, as a way we can respond to new atheism, where are the positive beliefs for atheism, new atheism? What is the contribution for society? And is that a way that we can respond to new atheism in a way that's conversant? Thirdly, a more specific question to your talk. I'm just thinking about number 3, the moral theistic sign. I find that, and I want to ask how we respond to this, atheists can get really touchy when you start discussing their morality. I'm thinking of the book by the Harvard humanist, Good Without God. I think it was Greg Epstein. What 1 billion non-religious people believe about God. How can we respond to our atheist friends who say, hey, my morality has nothing to do with God. It's not a sign of God to me at all. I'm just a good person. I believe in the inherent goodness of just humankind. So, thank you.
Yeah. Well, I don't believe in the inherent goodness of humankind. I believe humans have an inherent goodness in the sense of value or worth, but I don't think we're all that great. And my own view is that the best moral people I know are the people who are the most acutely conscious of the gap between their lives and their own ideals. The people who say, I'm a pretty good person, I'm better than my neighbor, are usually not the most deeply moral people that you will meet. So that, I think, is an important point to make. The other thing that I would say is my argument in my forthcoming book is not an argument that atheists can't be morally good in the relative sense in which humans can be morally good. That is, it's a kind of relative sense, because there's a sense in which none of us, I think, really make the mark, Christians or atheists. But in the relative sense in which we talk of moral goodness, atheists can be morally good, and certainly they can believe in morality. That's not my argument at all. In fact, I want atheists to believe in morality. I don't want them to be error theorists. I don't want them to be moral skeptics, because I want to mount a moral argument to push them in the direction of belief in God. And the premises of that argument require them to believe that there are moral obligations, that there are objective moral obligations. So it's part of my view that people who are non-believers can know and recognize their moral obligations and sometimes follow them. So I think we can affirm that, and there's no reason to deny it, nor do we have to deny what we probably couldn't deny in any case, that there are lots of Christians who do bad things, who are morally not so great. I think C.S. Lewis once says, we should judge Christians not by whether they're better than non-Christians, but by whether they're better than they would have been. That may be the right standard. So I'll just answer that. I won't try and answer the others right now.
Okay, thank you. So we have time for one more question.
I really enjoyed your presentation. Now my question is, as I sat and listened to you, I could not help but think of this question. What is New Atheism saying about other religions like Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism? What are they saying about them? Do they have evidence for their faith, or is it just primal, as you mentioned, and it's not important?
Well, they're generally saying that religions are just bad, all of them. They're willing to make some grudging, modest, relative judgments. Some are not as bad as others. And Buddhism often gets a little bit of a free pass, but not much of one. It reminds me of Chesterton's famous quip. He said he met a man who said, Christianity and Buddhism are very much alike, especially Buddhism. So I think there's a tendency to give a free pass, but not to any religion poisons everything. They're all bad. I think there's no doubt that Islam probably draws even more animus than Christianity and Judaism, but Christianity and Judaism, on their view, are pretty bad too. So they're not willing to make much in the way of relative judgments or accept lesser evils. They think we're just all better off. We would all be much better off if we could somehow excise religion from our world. I think they're probably deluded in thinking that's going to be easy. They think that if we could just get laws passed saying that children aren't allowed to be taught anything about God until they're 15 or something, that it would all go away. But I think the experiences of China and Russia suggest that that's probably not true under communism, the way religion survived and even thrived, even under those kinds of official repression.
Thank you all for coming. Please express your appreciation to Dr. Evans. Thank you.